Hello everyone, my name is Eric. I'm a limited licensed master social worker and psychotherapist. I've been working with children, youth, and adults for 10 years. On this week's episode of So You Want to Learn Psychology, we're going to be taking a look at what is probably Carl Rogers' most famous work, On Becoming a Person. Wow, this book really changed my views of psychotherapy early on in my career when I initially read it. I think I was maybe 25 or 26 when I read it, which I consider to be a long time ago. When you go to school to become a social worker or a psychotherapist, you are told that in pretty much every respect you must practice from a client-centered perspective. To be honest, virtually every kind of psychotherapy, whether it's CBT, DBT, psychodynamic psychotherapy, group therapy, substance use treatment, it really doesn't matter. It's essentially client-centered, meaning that there is unconditional positive regard for the person you're working with, and that you start from where the client is, not where they're expected to be, not where you want them to be, where they are in this very moment. Carl Rogers is the figurehead of client-centered psychotherapy. That's not to say that he's solely responsible for what it is today, but what's honestly very unfortunate is that Carl Rogers doesn't really receive the credit that he deserves for the complete structural change in psychotherapy that he spearheaded. You hear people call themselves Jungians and Freudians, but you never hear anyone call themselves Rogerian psychotherapists, but in reality, virtually 99% of us are Rogerian psychotherapists. I think that it has to do with the actual tangible level of humanity that Rogers' writings reflect. He was simply a man trying to understand and help his fellow man. All of his interventions and methods are so innately human that they're almost taken for granted nowadays. But in this book, On Becoming a Person, there's a genuine beacon of psychotherapeutic insight that focuses much less on the theories of psychology and more wholly on the grounded aspects of how we relate to other people. We cannot change, we cannot move away from what we are until we accept what we are. Acceptance of ourselves, of who we are deep down, of our own limitations, is the prerequisite for change. If we cannot accept who we are, then we have no sound starting point to begin from. We live under an illusion, pretending that we're something other than what we are. We can't make any real changes because this false self has no basis in reality. If our starting point is not from truth, then no truth can come from it. If you begin your journey of self-discovery and attempt to change your life, but you begin with the false premise of a starting point from self-hatred or self-deception, then, unfortunately, we're quarreling with ghosts. This self-hatred, influenced by your own self-deception, is aimed at a fundamentally inaccurate and unreal self. A basic postulate of ACT is acceptance. Acceptance of who you are, what you can do, what you can offer, and the acceptance of what might have happened to you. Acceptance is the last phase of grief, and it is this grief that's associated with the loss of a fundamental knowing of yourself that can sometimes be the most painful loss of all. I once worked with a woman who was once diagnosed as borderline, and when I asked if she knew what it meant, she said no and asked me to explain it, even though she had been diagnosed for over 30 years. When I asked her about her concept of self, I asked, "Do you feel like deep down you know who you are?" She responded, "Oh, honey, I don't think I ever really knew." This was a painful admission for her, though she said it quite unemotionally. I could tell it was one of those questions that she had given up the search for the answer to a long time ago. The second chapter of this book is called Some Hypotheses on the Facilitation of Personal Growth. The following quote appears very early in the chapter, and whether Rogers knew it or not, it would become the bedrock of modern psychotherapy in every single instance. He wrote, "One brief way of describing the change that has taken place in me is to say that early in my professional years, I was asking the question, how can I treat or cure or change this person? Now, I would phrase the question this way, how can I provide a relationship which this person may use for his own personal growth?" The therapeutic relationship is the most important part of psychotherapy. It's not the interventions, it's not the method or the theory, it's the relationship. I think that intuitively, clients understand this, but insurance companies sure don't. When you write a progress note, you can't simply say that your intervention was working on the therapeutic relationship. But what's important in this life and in this world is not proving yourself or proving your worth by means of methods of evidence based interventions, but by real, genuine human connection and interaction. If you've never been to therapy before and you're consider going for the first time, do not concern yourself with anything more than this question. Do you think you're going to like your therapist? If the answer is no, find another. If the answer is maybe, or that you could see yourself talking to this person, then give it a shot. And if you feel comfortable immediately after you walk in the room, you sit down, discuss what's going on, and you feel heard, respected, and received, then you have found a good therapist. Don't concern yourself with credentials. Don't concern yourself with whether or not they're ACT or ERP or DBT or CBT certified in anything else, because quite honestly, none of it matters. Except in the case of EMDR, you certainly wouldn't want to do EMDR with someone who's not certified to do it. Certifications mean virtually nothing other than this person watched an 8-hour Zoom lecture and paid $300 to add some letters to the end of their name. They mean nothing. The therapeutic relationship means everything. Now, of course, people who are therapists who specialize and are certified in many different therapeutic techniques would probably disagree with me, but that's fine because I genuinely don't care what other people think. It's okay to disagree. That's life. And funnily enough, one of the most influential quotes from this book parallels exactly how I feel. Rogers writes, "Evaluation by others is not a guide for me. The judgment of others, while they are to be listened to and taken into account for what they are, can never be a guide for me." This has been a hard thing to learn. I remember how shaken I was in the early days when a scholarly, thoughtful man, who seemed to me a much more competent and knowledgeable psychologist than I, told me what a mistake I was making by getting interested in psychotherapy. It could never lead anywhere, and as a psychologist, I would never even have the opportunity to practice it. In later years, it has sometimes jolted me a bit to learn that I am, in the eyes of others, a fraud, a person practicing medicine without a license, an author of a very superficial or damaging sort of therapy, a power seeker, a mystic. And I've been equally concerned because I've come to feel that only one person, at least in my lifetime or perhaps ever, can know whether what I am doing is honest, thorough, open, and sound, or false and defensive and unsound. And I am that person. I'm happy to get all sorts of evidence regarding what I'm doing, and criticism, both friendly and hostile, and praise, both sincere and fawning. They're all parts of such evidence. But to weigh this evidence and determine its meaning or usefulness is a task that I cannot relinquish to anyone else. I've kind of always been this way. I grew up skateboarding. In fact, I still skate to this day, and I work part of my summers as a skateboarding coach at a summer camp for kids. When I was younger, I was a punk-ass skater kid, and I really didn't give a shit about what anyone thought about me, and I still don't. I think skateboarding and punk rock music played a huge part in becoming the person that I am today, and it also made it so much easier to do as I got older, which some people don't learn until far later in life, which is something I've helped a lot of my clients with, especially those who battle social anxiety. Who am I really? How can I get in touch with this real self that's underlying all my surface behavior? How can I become myself? Carl Rogers put into words what, intuitively, a lot of us know already, but what I find is that my clients in psychotherapy come to learn how liberating this feeling is no matter when they happen to fall upon the discovery. He discovers how much of his life is guided by what he thinks he should be, not by what he is. Often, he discovers that he exists only in response to the demands of others, that he seems to have no self of his own, that he is only trying to think and feel and behave in the ways that others believe he ought to think, feel, and behave. It is the openness of awareness to what exists in this moment, in oneself, and in the situation is, I believe, an important element in the description of the person that emerges from therapy. What Rogers meant by this was that despite thinking you know who you are as defined by your passions, your goals, your personal peculiarities, your quirks, mannerisms, and character traits, what really determines whether a person knows who they are is whether they can just be themselves. In this moment, you may be sad, frustrated, annoyed, bored, maybe even content. And that is the essence of who you truly are. That's called being authentic. And whenever you try to cope with anything, whether it's feelings of anger, frustration, boredom, anxiety, you are not being your authentic self. You're doing the best you can in the moment to be someone you're not. And although that's probably for the best in terms of preserving your social image and mental health, it does damage to the functional expression of your true self. I'm not saying that you should just go around screaming when you're upset, talking shit behind people's back when you're irritated, recoiling in fear when you're anxious, or drinking when you're bored. Of course, that's not what I mean. It's not what Rogers means either. What is meant here is that until you accept who you are deep down, and can accept that who you are is not who you are in relation to others, or who I am as defined by my goals, my relationship, or my job, or who I wish I was, or who I want to become, then no real change or satisfaction can come to you, because you're, in fact, not you. You're not even you. For some people, the hardest fought battle of their entire life was trying to figure out who they are. The answer has always been there, right in front of them, yet it remained shrouded in a haze, obscured by the expectations of others, the delusional aspirations of a grandiose, ideal self-image. You are who you are, and you are enough as you are. That is unconditional self-acceptance, another Rogerian term that, although it has fallen completely out of the psychological lexicon, is more important than ever in a world inhabited by people who roam the earth as soulless, empty shells. That concludes this week's episode of So You Want to Learn Psychology? I hope you enjoyed. Next week, I'm going to follow up on a second part to this book dedicated to Rogers' 7 stages of change in psychotherapy, something that I think a lot of psychology students have probably never even heard of, but it's a very illuminating idea and framework to follow if practicing psychotherapy. Change is a process, and it can be understood as such. Come back next week to learn more. Until next time.